Hello, I'm Katla with Sjorvaldar Vikings, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about natural dyeing and the process they went through during Viking Age Scandinavia. Now, let's talk about our idea of what we perceive the look of the Vikings to be. Most of what we think and what we know about, or believe we know about, is portrayed in movies and television series like History's Vikings and The Last Kingdom. And when you look at those characters, you're seeing a lot of browns and leathers and other things like that. And so the typical perception of a Viking looks kind of like a biker. And I'm here to tell you that is not true at all. Vikings prided themselves on being able to wear bright colors, beautiful shiny jewelry and embellishments on their clothing, and the brighter and more vivid the color, the better. So let's just dispel that belief right here and right now. Now, yes, we do find pieces of clothing, and a lot of the time when we see the images of them, they're brown, but that has a lot to do with the minerals in the dirt, the decomposition in the soil, and other things like that. In the modern day that we have now, we're actually able to use science and chemical analysis to find out the actual plants that were used of these colors, and even how much, which is going to tell you the value of the color or the saturation. So that tells us a lot about the status of the person as well. So the question is, what did they actually use to get these colors? Now, we know from archaeobotanists looking at dye sites and other areas where they have found natural dye deposits from these sites where they actually dyed clothing. They have found seeds and stems and roots and plant matter. Now, they're able to look at fabrics that they find and use the scientific analysis to see many things. Some fabrics don't even come up with any dye stuff analysis because it's been too long, they've degraded too much, or the other thought process is maybe that they've actually used the wayside plants that were in the soil that you're finding. So you're finding bits and pieces of different plants that are in the soil, so you're not quite sure whether it was dyed with that or it just happened to be next to it when the clothing was first put into the ground in whatever way it ended up here. They are also able to look at the actual fabrics, if there is enough of the dye stuff left. They found things like madder, which you can get different shades of reds and oranges. And then they've also found woad and weld. And they found that they've also done overdying. So if you look at this color, this is actually overdying of woad and madder. So it's blue, but it has a little bit of a more purple tint. This color is a blending of the woad and the weld. Now, when you look at these brighter, more interesting colors, or the secondary colors that you see, you're gonna find that these tend to be the clothing of people who were more wealthy. Because if you think about it, I found some ivy or some other plant that really isn't going to hold the color too well, but it's something to add to my dye pot, to add pigment to the wool that I have spun and made into clothing, or eventually will make into clothing. That's something that I can do if I don't have a lot of money. But if I do have money, I do have wealth, and I'm able to trade or even cultivate some of these dye plants, I'm able to have a darker pigment. So if you look at these two different colors here, there's woad. These both are woad. The darker of the two would be the color of somebody who has more money because they can afford to use more of that particular plant. Now here, this is maybe I only had a little bit, or the Jarl of the community and all the wealthier people have already gone through and they've used the majority of the pigment from the dye, and it's left with this. So maybe I can pop mine in for just the end of it and get a little bit of color. So if you're seeing where I'm going with this, depending on what they can trade for and what they can afford the amount, because the more of the dye stuff, the more of the vivid color. Then we move on to other options for dyeing. Now here you can see a lot of what's called lichen. It looks similar to moss or what other people have called old man's beard. But surprisingly, there is many, many, many species of lichen. And you can see just in the little differences, some of these are yellowy orange, some of them are green, they maybe have the same color, but the texture is different. Different species grow on different trees, and you can extract a variation of different colors. Now, most of the colors tend to be creams and butters and tans and golds, but sometimes with certain modifiers, and we'll touch on that later, you can shift the color to greens or browns. Now, if you look here, this particular species is called usnea. Now, with the usnea, I was able to get these tones. Now, you can see this is wool, and these are silks. And they were all the same batch, but different fibers create different colors, even with the same amount of pigment and the same modifiers. There are some species of lichen, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. You can actually ferment them in ammonia. And if you let them sit long enough and get air and put them in kind of a dark place, certain species will extract really exciting colors, like purples and reds. Now, this ammonia here was from the Dollar Tree, because I'm a modern girl and I live in a modern world, so why not? But in the Viking Age, where do you think that ammonia came from? Well, it certainly didn't come from the Dollar Tree. What usually would happen is you'd pee in a pot and you let it sit and get funky and you throw that lichen into it. Now, there are varying species of lichen that can get different pigments, and they're usually chlorine reactive. So you can know that by taking some of the lichen, and I don't have any of that particular species here, but if you would take some of the lichen and you scratch off a little bit of that first layer, in this case, which is green, and you'll see white underneath. You put a little bit of bleach on there, and if it flashes a purple or a red color, that's when you know you're in business and you have a chlorine reactive lichen. But there are some, like this Evernea that's in here, that does not have the chlorine reaction. You just have to be able to identify them accordingly, and that's when you know. But even now, this one has been a pain, and it's not extracting correctly. So some of the ones that are not chlorine reactive are a little harder to extract these fun pigments from. So, that being said, lichen can take a really long time to grow, guys. So really, if you're trying this at home, please respect the ecology and only pick up fallen lichen from trees during storms, for example. Maybe they've fallen on a branch and they're still attached. Maybe they've just fallen from the sky, from the trees. But please, know that these lichen take a long time to grow, and if you want to be able to go back and forage them again, you should really leave them to grow and only take what has fallen. And that's about foraging and respecting nature as well. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about a more exotic dye, and this is called cochineal. Cochineal is a beautiful red, pink, purpley variation. Now, what is cochineal? Cochineal is actually an insect from the lice family. Now, I happen to have some of it here. And if you look, they're little itty bitty bugs. And what you need to do to get these bugs going is you need to crush them with a mortar and pestle or something else hard and create the breaking up of these hard little bodies. And as you can see, as you crush them up more and create more of a powder, you'll be able to get a red color. In modern day, most of our cochineal will come from the Americas, and that's where we mainly know it from. But back in the Viking era, in the time of trading, typically they found cochineal in places like Poland. Now this is similar bug, but just a different location. There was another type of lice insect that they used in the Viking Age. That was called kermes. Before the popularity of cochineal, whether it be in the Viking Age or the New World in modern day, Kermes was used. It has a very similar color, but over the years, it has pretty much disappeared. So if I was to go and try and buy Kermes instead of cochineal, I would be paying about $150 per gram. So very, very small amount, not even enough to get enough pigment. So that being said, that was another exotic color that was really exciting to the Vikings and a little bit more fun to extract. So let's talk a little bit more about the process. How do you start this dyeing process? First, what you do is typically you're going to use yarn. Now they find a lot more evidence of yarn being dyed than actual fabric, because if fabric was found being dyed after the fact, they would find little spots where it didn't get all the way through and saturated, and at least here or there, and they'd be able to determine that usually the yarn was dyed first. This is not always the case, but they are finding more findings of the yarn being dyed before it's woven. So you take the yarn, and most of the time you're going to want to mordant the yarn. Now what's mordanting? Mordanting is going to make the color stay better. Modern day mordanting is things like alum and cream of tartar, and it's what you do prior to the actual dyeing. It's a similar process of cooking the water and the ingredient with the wool, and that makes it saturate in there. Back in the olden days, Viking Age, Scandinavia, even some in the medieval times, they used other plants that they found that were aluminum absorbent. One of these examples is a plant called club moss. Now, club moss grows specifically in Scandinavia, and they know that they used it as a mordant back in that time frame. But they found it in York, which is a Viking settlement. So they knew they brought it over specifically for the mordanting of materials, for dyeing. The next part of the process is the actual dyeing or the extraction. And this is typically pretty easy. Most of the time, you just take the items that you're going to use as the ingredients for the dye, whether it be roots or powdered bits of leaves and this and that, and you put it into a pot of water. And usually you just let that simmer for an hour or so. Other things like the cochineal or the kermes, you have to do an extraction process, so that makes it a little bit more difficult. But typically, you're going to get the water to a certain temperature and have the dye stuff in there. Certain dyes, like madder, are also temperature dependent. So you find that if you go too hot, it gets a brown color. If you stay in the right temperature frame, it's going to be more red. So that can make a big difference with just the temperature of certain plants. The next part of the process is once you've had that pigment extracting for the right amount of time at the right temperature, you take your materials or your fibers and you put them in the pot. Once they're in the pot, they sit for usually about an hour. And at that point, they're pulling in the pigment into the different fibers. And you're usually going to start to see a shift and acceptance of color after at least 30 minutes to an hour. You can also adjust some of these things. So certain colors, you'll find that they'll be shifted with these additives, and I mentioned that before. So things like iron, those can what's called satin the color, make it darker, make it a little bit more drab or deeper. You can also find that using different waters can make a difference. So whether you're using distilled water or tap water can give you a range of different colors as well, as you can see in my cochineal. These were both done in the same amount of dye, but one was distilled water and one was tap water. Just so you guys can see the process of using a natural dye stuff, I'm going to take a selection of lichen and use that to dye some fiber. Now, normally I would take the lichen and sort it out according to its species and the type of lichen. But in this case, I'm just going to throw it all into one pot. This pot that we have actually was sitting out for a little while and it got a little bit of rust inside. But for us, we don't see that as a problem. We like the rust because it's going to sadden the color like we talked about before. First, we're going to bring the water to temperature. And once we get it to a hot, almost boiling temperature, we add the lichen. Now the lichen will sit there and it'll simmer for a good hour or so, just to really see that we've extracted pigment. Once we've extracted the pigment from the dye stuff, we will then add our fiber to the vat. But for the sake of just giving you guys an example, we threw it all in the pot and figured we could sort it out later. We got the time. After about an hour of simmering the fiber and the dye stuff together, we remove the pot from the fire. And what we are going to do in this instance is we're going to let it just cool and let it sit overnight, hoping to get as much pigment as we can from the dye stuff into the fibers. And once we pull it out, we'll be able to see what we have. So just to let you guys know, as I was saying before, with all the additives and all the variables, natural dyeing is a lot like alchemy. It's magic and you never know what you're going to get, so you have to go into it with lowered expectations. It's always a surprise, and that is part of the fun of doing natural dyeing. I hope you guys have enjoyed learning about natural dyes and in the context in the Viking Age, along with some modern tips and tidbits. I look forward to seeing you guys at our next event, or maybe one of yours. Please come and say hello and ask us any questions you'd like. We always love to talk. Have a wonderful day.